studying the Gospels, I discovered a second very helpful key for their understanding. The second key has a direct bearing on how we attempt to solve the synoptic problem, a subject with which I never intended to get involved. It is an erudite subject that has spawned volumes of academic discussion. Nevertheless, over the course of my translation work, I came to abandon the widely accepted idea that Mark had written first. Instead, I concluded that Luke had written the first canonical gospel, Mark, and then Matthew followed. Let me offer some reasons why I broke with the prevailing view. The two-document hypothesis of Markan priority assumes that Mark wrote first and that Matthew and Luke independently consulted his gospel. Hence, Mark constitutes one of the two documents of the hypothesis. The other document or source that Matthew and Luke consulted has been labeled Q by scholars. Q is an abbreviation for the German word Quell, which means source having learned this hypothesis in seminary and having accepted it as more factual than hypothetical. I embarked upon a new translation of Mark into modern Hebrew in 1959. While translating, I noticed that in passages where I could examine material common to both Mark and Luke, Luke's Greek was noticeably easier to render into a smooth Hebrew. That is to say, when reading Luke, I normally could translate his Greek into Hebrew with great ease and without a number of the problems that I encountered when translating Mark's Greek into Hebrew. That was the first important clue. Then I noticed the second clue to the relationship of the Synoptic Gospels. In the more than 70 pericope story units shared by Mark and Luke, the wording in Greek differed between these parallels by up to 60%. I also discovered that most of these differences were simply the result of one of the evangelists introducing synonyms for the wording of the other. In stories common to Mark and Luke, the two evangelists never agree for more than 5 words to use. The same wording, I concluded that either Luke was changing Mark or Mark was changing Luke, because Luke's gospel can be translated back into Hebrew more easily than Mark's, suggesting that Luke reflects more closely an earlier Hebrew stratum of the synoptic tradition. I decided that Mark had reworked Luke, a good triple tradition story for seeing Mark at work is the healing of the paralytic, Matthew chapter 9 and 8, Mark chapter 2 conquent 1 to 12, and Luke chapter 5, 17, 26. In Kurt Allen's synopsis of the 4 Gospels, one finds this story labeled as pericope numbers 43 and 92. The story is about some men who attempt to carry a paralytic on a pallet to Jesus. Upon realizing that a large crowd is preventing access to Jesus, they lift the paralytic onto the roof and lower him on his bed right in front of Jesus. Luke used the Greek noun kline to describe the bed on which the man rested. Mark wrote krabatos, which some Greek purists view as a slightly vulgar word. Krabatos means pallet, and it is also found in Acts 9:33, where another paralytic named Aeneas received healing. So Luke felt comfortable using either kline, Luke 5:18, or krabatos, Acts 9:33. But why did Mark write krabatos, or why in the same story did Mark opt not to use Luke's word for roof? Luke uses doma, but Mark writes stege. Mark and Luke present the same story. A number of their sentences are basically identical. Many of the same words appear in both versions. So what motivated this method of synonymic interchange? I came to realize that Mark wrote a gospel of equivalence. He had what might be called the Targumist mentality. He seems to have said to himself, where Luke's gospel has one word, I will use its synonym. Mark's method constitutes a whole system of interpretation. However, his method is neither without purpose or precedent. If we consult the ancient Aramaic translations of the Bible, such as Targum, Pseudo-Jonathan, and ancient Hebrew and Aramaic paraphrases of the Pentateuchal narratives, such as the Genesis Apocryphon and the Book of Jubilees, we will discover that Mark's manner of writing includes some features that also can be found in this Targumic genre of literature. Mark's freedom in reworking his Lucan source may be glimpsed in his addition of details such as personal names and people's emotions. Josephus displayed similar habits when he wrote his Jewish antiquities in Greek. By replacing kline with krabatos, Mark makes a subtle allusion to an incident involving the paralyzed Aeneas. Mark may have reasoned Jesus did a great miracle in healing the man who was lowered through the roof. And do not forget that our risen Lord healed Aeneas too, by means of his choice of words. Mark stimulates the person reading these texts in Greek to think of other passages and stories from the books of the Bible and beyond, to which Mark hints through the lifting of vocabulary and details. His purpose is to splice his composition into a much larger tapestry of biblical literature, and by doing so, he has enriched our reading of his gospel. How I worked through the first three gospels and finally concluded that Luke wrote first and Mark used Luke as his primary source is quite involved and would require a lengthy technical discussion outside the scope of this lecture. What I want the reader to realize is that in order to get back to the earliest version of a triple tradition story, he or she must place an emphasis on the Lucan version. Mark has left us an intricate pattern of literary arabesque based upon Luke's text. Once a person recognizes Mark's method, then he or she can study comparatively the Matthean, Markan, and Lucan parallels in order to isolate the earliest and most historical sketch of Jesus preserved in the triple tradition. How does Mark's method affect Matthew? I found that many of Mark's changes and additions appear also in Matthew. In other words, wherever Mark and Matthew's Gospels run in parallel, by his method of writing, Mark influenced Matthew, but Matthew relied on two principal sources for his Gospel. One was Mark, the other was an older source with fantastically preserved material about the historical Jesus. In the triple tradition, whenever Matthew abandoned Mark's wording, we sometimes can catch glimpses of this earlier source percolating up through Matthew's composition. This helps us understand why scholars speak so highly of Q, Luke, and Matthew's common source. This double tradition material has escaped Mark's literary influence.